Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Oona Hathaway. Oona is a professor of international law at Yale Law School, an expert on global legal challenges and U.S. foreign relations. She directs the Yale Law School Center for Global Legal Challenges and is the president of the American Society of International Law. Her writing appears in major law journals and publications like the New York Times and Foreign Affairs. Today's headlines focus on White House denials regarding viral media, renewed conflict in Gaza, and U.S. Supreme Court action on immigration enforcement. Oona, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Professor. We're very excited to have you here today, in part because there's so much happening, I would say, in kind of the international law realm. We're in this moment, I think, where we have a president who I think is often skeptical about commitments the United States has made in the past. And I wonder if you could give for our listeners, your sense of how things are changing in this second administration. Is there a dynamic change happening with regard to the international norms the United States is acknowledging, or are we retreading ground in the sense that much of the change had occurred in the past and we're living in the kind of wake of it? How do you see those changes taking place?
Yeah, I mean, it's really striking. It's striking not just how much has changed between Trump and his predecessors, but how much has changed between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Some of the key changes that we've seen since Trump became president again, and I think the most striking and most important change has been a willingness to basically question the kind of core principles of the post-war international legal order. So Trump 1, you didn't see this so much. I mean, maybe it was a little bit behind the scenes or underneath the surface, but you never really saw it kind of break out in the open. This idea that there was a willingness to question the kind of basic idea that states should agree not to go to war with each other. So the United Nations Charter, which was adopted after World War II, provides that states revoke the right to unilaterally use force against one another. And the only exception to that is self-defense or if authorized by the UN Security Council. And we have seen, so the United States really was the champion of this idea, really fought for this idea in the war. This was obviously contrary to the values and aspirations of Hitler and the Axis, which is all about conquest and using war to aggrandize their states and add territory. And so the central kind of principle for which we fought in World War II was this basic idea of a prohibition on war and renunciation of the right of conquest and renunciation of a right to go to war unilaterally. And what we're seeing in the second Trump administration is what seems to be a willingness to kind of throw that all away. Now, I say seems to because there's a lot of talk and there hasn't been as much action, although I will say no action consistent with this. So you hear him talking about things like making Canada the 51st state, or taking back the Panama Canal, or taking Greenland. These are really clear threats to upend the global legal order and the kinds of threats we really didn't hear in Trump 1. Now one might say, well, it's a lot of bluster, this is Trump kind of being Trump and saying kind of crazy things. But the people who are on the receiving end of this don't think it's just bluster. Europe, I think, is deeply concerned. Canada is deeply concerned. You see states willing to invest more in their own defense. They're thinking about how to reorient themselves in a world in which the United States not only is not maintaining the global order, but might be ready to upend it and attack it. And then you also see things like Trump strikes on Iran, which was clearly illegal, right? So those are actually actions that are unlawful actions, using military force unilaterally without seeking any kind of consent from the Security Council or really making an attempt to make a good case that it's consistent with international law. So that's the kind of number one big shift that we're seeing. I mean, there's lots else going on, but that's the thing that I think is most important and that really worries me the most.
Could I briefly jump in with a follow-up question? Is Trump really different? We saw, of course, President Bush ignore international law, President Obama with drone strikes, and going back to Bush with the treatment of detainees. Is President Trump really moving that far beyond the norm?
It's a good question. And this is a fair point. Iraq in particular was a major affront to the idea that states shouldn't be able to just use force to enforce their will. And, it is important to note that at least there was an attempt at a legal claim there. So the claim was that there were weapons of mass destruction, that it was necessary for U.S. self-defense, that, if the United States didn't act, that the result was going to be a nuclear disaster. Of course, those claims turned out not to be true, but had they in fact been true, then there may have been some justification, although I think even then, the failure to get Security Council authorization, and we could go into the details of the many legal failures, but the rest of the world, I think, views that as an illegal intervention, and I think rightly so. And so, one might say, well, so, is what Trump's doing really all that different? And I think it is different. It's different in a couple respects. It's different first in, as I mentioned, the Bush administration at least tried to kind of come up with a good argument. You might say like, oh, that's a really kind of thin, fig leaf. But, the lawyers worked hard to try and come up with justification consistent with the principles of international law. You had, John Bellinger and the rest of the lawyers sort of trying to come up with a good argument, and they convinced the United Kingdom that they had a good enough argument. They went to the Security Council and they provided the evidence that they had. Again, turned out to be false. But Colin Powell, I don't think necessarily knew, I don't think he knew that the evidence he was presenting was false. So and there were a number of allies who were, participating in that effort and who were persuaded that this was justified, even though, again, in the end, I think it wasn't. Here, what we're seeing is like none of that effort, and a kind of cavalier attitude towards the international order that seems to suggest a kind of willingness to kind of throw it all away. Now, that said, I do think that, there is a responsibility that predecessors have and that lawyers who've worked for predecessors have for, in a way, kind of setting the table for what's happening now. I do think Iraq was, a tragedy, and I think undermined much of the world's trust in the idea that these were principles that were universal. And then I think Obama, again, counterterrorism operations and expansion of self-defense justification to include wide range of quote unquote counterterrorism plans, but wasn't ever clear that, for instance, ISIS actually posed a real threat to the United States that justified, the bombing in Iraq and Syria that the Obama administration engaged in starting in 2014. So I think the point is fair. But it's one thing to be kind of breaking the rules here and there, and another thing to sort of be willing to kind of invade your neighbor, or at least suggest that you will do that, to take Greenland, to seize territory. It's just a different order of magnitude kind of affront to the international order, and I think threatens to just kind of throw the whole thing out the window. Whereas I think the previous actions were sort of cracks in the veneer that were undermining it slowly.
I want to, of course, let George speak, but I have to follow up one more time. What does that mean, to throw it out the window? What is the worst case scenario of the U.S. continuing to ignore international law in a world where there's already war and genocide? I mean, from a practical matter, why does it matter?
Yeah. Look, I think the fact that the United States, while, taking actions that were not always perfectly consistent with the UN Charter, nonetheless was largely defending these basic rules. For instance, doing overflight in the South China Sea to try and enforce the legal claims of China's neighbors to the islands and reefs in the South China Sea, the supporting of Ukraine and its resistance against Russia's attempt to conquer its territory, the support for NATO and for all the defensive, preparations to enable the Baltic states to defend themselves if Russia were to try and invade. The kind of clear messaging the United States was not going to stand for a state invading its neighbor, including when the U.S. came to Kuwait's defense, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and tried to take over that territory. What Trump is signaling here is not only is the U.S. going to stop playing that role of trying to enforce those rules, but the U.S. is actually thinking about maybe kind of joining in the fray itself, and taking territory itself and using force, including things like, using force against drug cartels in Mexico and Venezuela as well, like actually extending policing operations into Latin America. And that then, if the U.S. starts doing that, it legitimizes everybody else doing the same thing, right? So then we can't really complain if China decides that, it wants a little bit of the Philippines, or, that a few of those islands would be handy to have, or if Russia wants to invade a few more of its neighbors, or if other states, decide that they're frustrated with their neighbor and want to invade and take territory, or territory looks, tantalizing and there's resources that they'd like, if the rules no longer apply, the whole system can break down. I mean, the thing to remember is that we have been living in a very different kind of world since World War II than existed for hundreds of years before that. For hundreds of years, it was legal and legitimate for states to invade one another and take one another's territory and stuff. Conquest and booty and prize were all part of the ordinary law of the game in the international legal order. And this was the kind of radical thing that the world did in renouncing war, first in 1928 and then reaffirming it in the UN Charter. And so we have lived with this peace. I mean, all of us in our memory have lived with this peace, and we kind of take it for granted, but it doesn't have to be that way. And once you take away this idea that states shouldn't be invading one another, shouldn't be simply taking their grievances and using military force to settle those grievances, you're going to see a much, much more violent world. And that's what I'm scared of. That's what I'm worried about. That's what I think is at stake here.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was very lucky to travel with some of the members of Project 2025 to Ukraine in the summer before President Trump was elected for the second time. And that's kind of a humming argument that kept kind of emerging and reemerging, where, if you move away from, acknowledging the, truly the travesty of Ukraine's invasion in this, quite imperialistic way by Russia, you set a precedent for others to do the same. And that's, as you say, I think that those of us who are advocates for international law have a lot to be concerned about. I do think that the sort of turn of the administration towards a more, tough on Russia stance, and the use of phrases like security guarantees by a U.S. president, quite extraordinary, having gone through the history of that kind of talk towards Ukraine. I would ask, I'm always trying to think about, what comes afterwards, or how do we talk about a different path. I went back and I read Elihu Root's Nobel Prize address. And I think of this character as kind of hugely important because President Trump is always so interested in President McKinley. And, there are so many wonderful books about that period, but one of them, First Great Triumph, kind of paints Elihu Root as one of these kind of five figures who shaped McKinley's foreign policy, right? And so if you read that book and you don't go any further, you would look at Elihu Root as this sort of ardent imperialist who is totally willing to help the United States in the sort of Spanish-American War and so on. But he says, and I'll stop right after this, but he says, where there is no law, a submission to arbitration or a judicial decision is not an appeal, is just an appeal, not to the rule of law, but to the known opinions and predilections of men who happen to be selected to decide, right? And so he's saying that without a body of international law, it's a very arbitrary set of, kind of appeals that we might make when injustice happens. And I wonder, how do you think that we could evolve away from this reordering to a restacking, which seems to be what Root was calling for back in 1912, before, those horrible wars that lead us to establish, the international legal system. And
yeah. I mean, look, Root is a product of his time. And I think it's really important to remember that time was not a lawless time. There was international law. It's just that international law was just completely different than it is today. All right. So the international law at the time was, if another state wrongs you, you can go to war against them. They fail to pay a debt. You go and take their stuff, in repayment. They, interfere with your trade relations. You go and destroy their ships. That was totally fine. That was the law of the day. And so he was a advocate for and a spokesperson for the law that existed at the time. And, the world decided that was, leading to two, extraordinary wars that led to tens of millions of deaths. And maybe that was not a great way to live in a world in which the technology of war allowed for this just extraordinary level of extermination of human beings in the pursuit of those aims by states. And so Root, was speaking for a certain kind of time. The thing is that if we go back to that rules that he was speaking for, we now have all that technology that allows a much more, a much more deadly kind of use of force. And, we're not prepared, I think, for what could come. The question, though, that you asked, that you started with, is kind of like what comes next. And I do think, there's part of me that it is mourning, what we're seeing happening to the international legal order, and, wants to do everything that I can to try and support retaining and maintaining that as best we can. But I think, the question you asked at the outset, Nathan, was, I think, a fair one, which is like, look, this has already been under pressure for a while. We've been seeing kind of assaults on this idea that states can't use force to achieve their ends for a while. And that's true, and there are lots of things that are not perfect about the modern international legal order. To name one, the states that won World War II created an international system that basically kind of cast their control over the United Nations in amber. And so the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, are the states that, quote unquote, won the war. So US, Russia, France, China, and the UK. It doesn't make a whole lot. Like those 5 states, if you were making a kind of who's going to be in charge today, that is not the 5 states you would choose. Like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Africa is completely excluded. Latin America is completely excluded. South America is completely excluded. So, you would design it very differently today. And a lot of states, I think, have some skepticism and understandable skepticism towards the international order, both because they don't have that kind of role that the United States has of kind of unusual control over the levers of international power. And because they see that there's been a lot of hypocrisy in the way in which the rules have been applied, that certain states get held to standards that others don't. So, as I start thinking about like, what do we do? What can be recovered here? I do think that, in addition to trying to hold on to what we can of this prohibition on use of force, because I think a descent into chaos and violence does no one any good. But I do think a kind of recognition that the system has been under pressure for a long time, and it's time to start rethinking it. And that we need to, for instance, create more ways for middle powers to play a significant role in governing the international order, that more states need to play a role in their defense. I don't think it's wrong to think that states in Europe probably need to rely less on the United States for their defense, for instance. So I think there are things that we can learn. It's not just trying to kind of staunch the bleeding of the system, but also trying to think about like, what can we do to make things better?
I mean, I'd be fascinated to ask, as a scholar of norms and, the kind of impact of, this sort of diffusion of ideas around the globe. I mean, would you agree with the observation that, while many of us may have seen trade as a type of soft power in the past, it's now perceived as a kind of hard power in the sense that it's a predicate to the ability to make war? I note this because I'm just astonished as I go around talking to conservatives in the legal field, in the trade world. That's so much of what they're trying to conceive of when they think about effective U.S. trade relations, right? And so I just couldn't have imagined when I was wandering around the MacMillan Center, thinking about international affairs as a young undergraduate, that we would get to this place where trade was actually like part of the war making, the hard power conversation. But maybe I'm mistaken. Yeah. What do you think?
No, I don't think you're wrong. I mean, it's actually, in a way, a kind of retrenchment to a world of old. So it used to be the case that states were sometimes reluctant to trade with states that they didn't trust were not going to come after them in the future. This is the kind of great realist paradox. So the realist paradox is basically states, when they trade with one another, they both may benefit. So let's say two states are trading with each other. They both may benefit, but one inevitably is going to benefit more than the other. And to the extent that they eventually could face one another in war, no state can live with the fact that the other state is benefiting more than they are because they're growing at a faster rate. And the more that you trade and the more you grow your economy, the more you're better able to, meet someone on the battlefield and overpower them in the battlefield. And so the idea of this paradox is that, so eventually these relations are going to break down. In fact, they really shouldn't exist in the first place. That paradox gets overcome in a world where you prohibit the use of force because you no longer have that fear, right? You no longer have to think, tomorrow my neighbor is going to invade me. So trading with them is, ultimately not going to be in my best interest because comparative advantage means that they're going to benefit and, they may benefit more than I do. And eventually this is going to have to break down because we might meet one another in the battlefield. And at the same time, what happened is that because states weren't able to use force against one another any longer to enforce their legal rights, they developed tools of economic suasion, of economic sanction, of economic response to violations. So we see the rise of economic sanctions. We see the rise of using economic power instead of violence to enforce the law. Now we're kind of coming back around, right? We're kind of seeing this world in which, Trump has a kind of mercantilist viewpoint about the world. And that mercantilist view is like, if you're benefiting, then I'm losing. It's a sort of very zero-sum kind of vision of international trade, which goes back to this vision that really is a kind of 1800s, early 1900s vision of how trade works that, of course, gave us the Smoot-Hawley Act and, gave us the Great Depression. It seems like he has a lot of those views, but he loves tariffs. He sees it as sort of like a way to build U.S. wealth without realizing that what he's doing is draining away U.S. power because the United States gets extraordinary power from its economic might and its ability to sanction other states. And the U.S. also has a distinctly stronger ability to use that economic power than basically anybody else because the dollar is the reserve currency of choice in the global economy. And as long as that's true, it's very hard for any state to kind of stay out of the American economy. But, he's creating a lot of incentive to create another reserve currency. And so all of this is draining away American power, is a short way of putting it. And I think he's just extremely wrong-headed. He certainly has a view. It's just a view that is just not consistent with the laws of economics. And it's very reminiscent when you read, scholars and thinkers of the 1800s. He sounds a lot like them.
I want to shift a little bit to these international organizations. I think a lot of people think they're feckless and useless when you hear calls for people to turn the UN into another Trump Tower and things like that. What should the U.S. and other states do to actually embolden international organizations so they can actually enforce laws?
Well, look, I mean, is the UN slow and cumbersome and bureaucratic? Yeah, no doubt. It certainly is. It's all those things. But it's also an extraordinarily important place for states to come together and debate their values and their view about what the world should look like. And it serves U.S. interests in an extraordinary way. I mean, the fact that the UN is located here in the U.S., gives us unparalleled access to the levers of power and to leaders from all over the world. So, we're extraordinarily lucky. Could it be stronger? Absolutely, sure. I mean, but the U.S. has never wanted that. It has never been interested in building the independent power of the UN. It has used the UN in many positive ways, often to kind of build relationship and to cooperate and collaborate with Russia and China on various initiatives. I mean, there've been a number of really important collaborative projects that I think have undermined what would otherwise be drivers of conflict. But the UN, there's 193 states. It's messy. That's just the reality of it. I mean, I've made a lot of arguments about why I think we should empower the General Assembly. So the UN Security Council has been unable to really get much done because each member of the permanent five, each P5 member that I mentioned before, has a veto over any action by the Security Council. And the Security Council is the one that is able to put in place enforcement actions. And between China, Russia, and the U.S., there are a lot of vetoes. The U.S. lately has been using its veto to prevent actions to deal with the situation in Gaza. Russia has obviously been using its veto to prevent action to deal with the situation in Ukraine. But the General Assembly is a separate body, and I think it could do more than it does. And that's where I would like to see more action. And who knows? I mean, maybe the U.S.'s kind of undermining of international institutions will create some of that impetus. But I think we haven't yet seen leaders kind of come to the fore, international leaders come to the fore who are kind of willing to lead that conversation. I think everybody's a little bit in shock right now. And whether that's going to happen, I think it's a big question. Are states going to be able to come together to try and build a kind of an international order that doesn't necessarily rely on or depend on the United States to be the impetus for it, which is really, I think, what, everyone has gotten a little lazy, to put it that way, relied on the U.S. to play that leadership role. And it's clear the U.S. is not interested in playing that role anymore. So the question is, can the rest of the world come together and do more without the U.S. leading the way?
Nathan, I have a final question, if that's okay. And we don't want to take too much of your time. Thank you so much. But, I'm interested, as someone who has sort of followed the different frameworks that international institutions have adopted to try to fulfill those, needs of the international community, the collective security needs in various questions. I mean, it strikes me that the 20th century was something of a laboratory for what succeeded and what failed, right? And so, I mean, there are many explanations, for example, regarding the League of Nations collapse and why it didn't fulfill its objectives. As I was in government trying to, come up with explanations about why it made sense for the United States to try to use tariffs to collect revenue, which is something which is quite heterodoxical. One thing that came to my mind is that, the United States, I would agree, is this kind of hegemon in some sense. Maybe it's hemispheric, maybe it's global, but we provide all these public goods to the trading system. And you can quantify the benefits that we receive as a result of being that hegemon. But it seems that the public, at least, has lost any sense that that is actually, redounding in our favor positively, or that it's only the wealthy that get all of those benefits, right? And so what I was trying to come up with was a concept that in order to make it worthwhile for the U.S. to sort of continue supporting the trading system, we should be receiving in revenue enough to offset, the cost of policing the Horn of Africa or propping up the dollar or so on. And so I just wonder, like, do you think that we're in this moment where we should be thinking about paradigm redesign and trying to, persuade, the public that clearly lost a sense that this kind of arrangement of the World Trade Organization and robust, free trade norms wasn't working? Or should we be trying to, explain to folks, no, like, you have these concerns, we should be addressing those, original kind of frameworks as something to kind of reestablish. How do you see this moment? I know it's a very long, complicated question, but
I hear it. Yeah, I hear you. Look, I think there are a number of mistakes that advocates of international trade made, and I think perhaps the biggest, I don't think, was advocacy of the international trade system. I actually think, on the whole, the economics are just kind of inarguable that trade makes sense as a way of generating global wealth, both for individual states and for the globe as a whole. But the benefits are broad-based. The benefits are broad-based, and the costs are very concentrated. So you have lower consumer. Consumer goods cost a lot less as a result of global free trade. But a lot of people lose their jobs, and the people who lose their jobs are concentrated in communities where they don't really have good alternatives. So you have the closing, early on of, U.S. manufacturing plants of various kinds. Of course, U.S. steel essentially disappeared, textiles, apparel, all these kinds of handicrafts, all of that disappeared from the United States. And that's whole communities lost their jobs as a result. And so it's understandable why people, saw that as a loss, because it was a deep loss. And, we didn't do enough or really, much of anything to try and address the harm to communities that resulted in providing adequate retraining, providing adequate trade adjustment assistance. I mean, we have a really small little trade adjustment assistance program that does a little bit, for communities that are hit, but it's just not nearly enough. And I also think that there wasn't enough attention to the fact that, some trade is distortive. It does have, for instance, if you trade with countries that have really lax environmental rules or really lax labor rules, they can naturally produce goods for much lower costs because they can do it in ways that don't face the same kind of regulatory conditions that we observe in the United States. And I do think the WTO was headed towards trying to deal with that problem. We could get into the complexities of it, but there was a move, I think, a beginning of a recognition that there needed to be some willingness to allow for differences in how goods were being produced and allow for states to charge for those differences. But I think what's happened is this kind of total rejection of the international trade system that Trump represents is kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's taking those grievances, which are real and valid, and those sense of loss, which is real and valid, and turning it into like a rejection of the system altogether, as opposed to trying to figure out how do we do a much better job of addressing the communities that have been hit hard by this, to provide some redistribution, retraining, et cetera. And also, how do we incorporate, do a better job of incorporating certain kinds of regulatory protections into our trading system, which, traditionally there've been a real resistance to. I think that's where I think we went wrong. But I don't think that like this idea that somehow we should like try to levy some like fee and then use that fee to like offset something. I just don't think that's how the system really works. I think we should create global surplus and then tax it, and use the taxes to provide assistance to the people who need it.
Thank you so much. I certainly take your points about dislocation. And, in New Haven itself, we have that marvelous worker village, which, eventually was hollowed out by many of the forces just mentioned. So right near where some of us live. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was the home of manufacturing. I mean, gun manufacturing, which, a lot of it now doesn't happen in the United States. A lot of factories in New Haven that was a source of all of its wealth. And we have lots of empty warehouses now that are now being turned into condos and art studios. There is a kind of gentrification happening, which has its own problems. It's a real problem. And I think there was a failure to recognize those costs, and those are real and important. And I think if we had done a better job of dealing with those problems, we may not be facing the kind of backlash that we're facing today.
Real quick, final thing before I let you go, I just have to ask this follow-up. To this point, right, with increased globalization, AI taking people's jobs, I worry that there's going to be quite a bit of desperation amongst normal people. It used to be you could play the game if you went to Columbia or Yale or Vanderbilt, you kind of win. Right? Life is kind of easy. Most people I know between the ages of 30 and 40 who did the right things, there's no comfort in that. And so it leads to me to think that people will not care about things that are abstract, like international law. And that, if you take a missile and you blow up a boat full of drug smugglers coming from Venezuela, it's not great, but I'm probably going to go hungry tonight, right? Do you worry that people just do not care about something that seems abstract to their daily life in driving this issue?
Yeah, I do. And, I'm the parent of two 20-something-year-olds. And so I understand that economic anxiety of the generation that's just trying to get their foothold in the workforce and how incredibly challenging that is, no matter how hard you've worked and no matter how good of an education you've earned. And, I think those anxieties are real. And I think it's true that then it's hard for people to care about things like, due process rights of, people who are not from the United States, the use of bombs to blow up some potential nuclear bunker in Iran, the fact that that's illegal, why should I care at all about that? I totally get that. I think the thing is that, this is why I do think we need to do a better job of explaining what the stakes are of this. And I do think the stakes are immense, because the stakes are, what kind of world are we going to live in? Are we going to be living in a world in which there's just so much more violence than there is now? And it's also, if that violence grows, and if states are invading their neighbors, and if trade, can be intercepted with force, and, we see the world retreating to what it was when the modern legal rules that prohibited use of force by states to settle their grievances, before those rules were put in place, that is going to throw the economy even further into disarray and throw the economy even deeper into a hole. And so, in the end, that's not going to do anybody any good. I also think that people don't want to see others suffer, so I do think, reminding people about the human cost that comes from these wars is also, an important thing. I think the American people are, do believe in the value of human life. And, the fact that we're potentially entering a much more violent era, even if Americans may not be directly at risk, at least immediately, the fact that a lot more people will be, I think many Americans would care about that.
Okay. Well, thank you again for generously giving us almost 40 minutes of your time. For our listeners, where can they follow your current work?
They can find me at oonahathaway.com.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. You should join us next time.